you guys missed in your history lessons. So, let's hop on to the story of a Viking who literally changed world history forever. Wait, world history? You mean our world? Well, yep, that might be the question that might have popped right into your head, was it? Alright, if you are someone very fond of history, then you might know that the story of the Berserker is very well known in Norse and English history. If you are not familiar with Berserkers, these guys are basically part of a group of legendary Norse warriors known for their brutality and irrational ferocity in combat. Furthermore, they are usually regarded as bodyguards and shock troops for royal and noble courts while worshipping Odin, the ultimate Norse deity. To start with the story, we might have to begin at the time of the year 1066. That's about the time when King Edward the Confessor died. So now what happened then? 3 persons made claims to the English throne following his death: William, Duke of Normandy, Harald of Norway, and Earl of Wessex. After a lifetime of plunder, Harald of Norway, who was a mighty and renowned conqueror, desired to settle down. Although William was also a Viking conqueror, he made a deal with the French to occupy Normandy to keep them safe from an English invasion. The only one of these 3 who was actually in England was Harald, who had the title of Earl of Wessex, which is just below Duke. Since the other 2 were absent from England, Harald of Wessex had sway over the country. When he learned that William from the south was launching an invasion, he marched his army to meet him. The levy time was over because William's soldiers became impatient while he was waiting. In case you didn't understand, back then, troops could only be sent for a limited time. So now, what he could do was to order home all of his troops. Now this is where he learns that Harald in the north is launching a Nordic invasion, and they invaded just because the wind was blowing south. As a result, he must now gather all of his forces and march halfway around the British Isles to Stamford Bridge, which is said to be close to York, the location of the Norwegian invasion. Now going through the childhood moral quote, "Where there is a will, there is a way," this trip took a week. The English arrived in 4 days, which caught Harald off unprepared. Now the English started their invasion, decimating the majority of Harald's forces and driving them across Stamford Bridge. What do you guys think the Vikings did against the English? Basically, most of these Viking warriors were caught off guard and had little time to put on their armor. But guess what? One berserker in the middle of the crowd in particular is well remembered for repelling the English for more than an hour, while his other warriors had time to reorganize, reevaluate, and resupply. Yes, an hour. When an Englishman boarded a barrel and floated down the river while stabbing the berserker with a spear in quite an unfavorable spot on his body, the soldier was finally brought to his knees. Following this, the English were able to flood the bridge and annihilate the Vikings, but that hour was quite remarkable in that it changed the entire course of history that came after it. Still don't believe us? Well, let me explain further. The winds then shifted once more after that. Now they blow north. The English Channel can now be crossed by William. Williams must now march southward toward Hastings, a tiny hamlet in southern England, after scouts inform the Herald of his landing. When he gets there, Harald settles in on Senlac Hill, where he creates a shield wall to defend himself from these intruders. But William pulls a quick one. What? William instructs his cavalry to stage a retreat to cause the English to break ranks and rush downward while the shield wall is continuing to rout his cavalry, and surprisingly that works. But unfortunately, the battle is lost when Harald of Wessex receives an arrow to the eye, establishing William as the new ruler of England. Well, you could see the Bayeux Tapestry, which depicts the Battle of Hastings. Now that the story has come to a finish, how do you think it totally altered world history? Isn't that what we told you guys? Okay, now the Norman conquest therefore altered every part of English culture, including the way people spoke and even influenced the creation of the British Empire. Yup, it's true, and ultimately the United States. Got it? In fact, it made the country that colonized every other place. Wait a second, we're not finished yet here. You guys might be thinking, how exactly is this even possible? Or how did one man hold off an entire army? Let's rewind a few minutes back, shall we? Basically in the story, the Saxon kings pissed off some Vikings. However, you know that upsetting a Viking chieftain is almost always followed by a great deal of murder and damaged feelings. A swarming horde of fierce Viking warriors sailed into England on a river of blood a few weeks after Harold Godwinson crowned himself king, and they immediately started destroying everything in their path like a raging plague of biblical locusts, devouring the firstborn of Egypt during the Great Flood. The armies of Mercia and Northumbria advanced in a futile attempt to stop the tide, but both forces were swiftly destroyed in a flurry of spinning, blood-stained long axes and warhammer-crunching guts. It seems like there was little the new king could do to stop this marauding army of deranged Viking madmen, as Scarborough was pillaged, destroyed, toppled over, and devoured by wolves. The Viking army was camped out at Stamford Bridge with their fucking loincloths down. But all of a sudden, the Saxon army had boarded their lovely four-wheel drive ATVs and traveled 180 miles in 4 days. Forgive me, just joking. Well, that is a mystery, right? The Saxons mobilized far more swiftly than the Norse chiefs had anticipated, and when the horizon suddenly came to life with the flying flags and dazzling steel of 5,000 enemy warriors, the Northmen realized they were beyond absolutely screwed. 1/3 of their army, along with the majority of their armor and weaponry, were still aboard the ships, nearly a day's march distant and of little help to these shambolic soldiers. The little Viking camp was located on the west bank of the river Derwent, and the charging Saxon army smashed into it, tearing the unprepared Norsemen to pieces. Please go gently as we go through this section. Those who weren't instantly reduced to smoldering heaps of cut limbs and melted flesh tried to cross Stamford Bridge and join up with the rest of their companions on the east side to reorganize. But even with the Northman army reeling and in total disorder, we know the Saxon army's victory wasn't simple. Yup, the answer to your doubt. The single man standing at the top of the bridge. While discreetly surveying the Saxon army, this large Norse berserker held a gigantic great axe with 2 double-bladed blades firmly in his aged, calloused hands. The duty of protecting the constrained bridge and affording his fellow Vikings some time to regroup fell to a lone hero, who would have been given permission by his king to die valiantly in battle. His ferocious eyes peered through the shadows like burning orbs of white-hot flame, covered by an enormous horned headpiece with metal plates supporting a mask made of the bleached bone fragments of a terrifying animal skull. A living demon that is depicted as if summoned literally from the depths of hell itself to wreak merciless revenge on any human bold or stupid enough to cross him and challenge anybody with enough guts to test his fury. The Saxon army charged the bridge with all of its might, hoping that the sheer weight of their numbers would drive this enormous beast from his position. However, this man, who stood guard over the narrow walkway above the raging waters of the river Derwent, was unyielding in his determination. The first column of soldiers plowed headlong at the Norsemen like a school bus crammed with brazen teens being thrown against a wall of unyielding spikes. Even the most courageous warriors were killed by his brutal blows, which also took down powerful champions. The battlefield was covered with severed limbs and severed heads. The river itself was stained with the blood of fallen soldiers, and the bridge soon looked as though a cheesy Halloween prop warehouse had just burst onto it. Wait, did we go too far with the metaphor? This determined fighter cut through the English like a chainsaw for over an hour. One shrewd Saxon warrior realized not to challenge this barbarian's strength after witnessing him wreak mayhem as cruel as you can imagine. The Viking was struck in his lone weak spot, his crotch, when the man jumped into a floating barrel on the river, drifted beneath the bridge, and thrust his spear up through the boards. The Saxons poured over the bridge and into the now organized Norse camp as he dropped to his knees, bemoaning his unhappy circumstance. One last fatal blow was thrown to the Berserker. So, looking at this, you can make out how much of today's logic applies to this. But if you ask us, we would point out the fact that he is a Viking, and if you go through the pages of the history of Vikings, you'll get to know that these guys are not to be played with. Alright, coming to the end of today's episode, did you guys love today's episode? Do you wish to see more of these videos on your feed? Make sure to follow us and subscribe to our channel.